In the last few years, the ACT branch of IPAN has campaigned most vigorously against the AUKUS agreement and increasing US militarisation of Australia, and against Israeli occupation and genocide in Palestine. If you haven't already done so, we'd appreciate if you could join our mailing list so that we can send you information about ongoing campaigns, protest actions, talk like these, both from IPAN but also a whole lot of other groups in Canberra. And it'd be great if you could consider joining us, becoming a member of IPAN. I'd also like to encourage you to participate in this year's IPAN conference, which is being held in Perth and online from the 4th to the 6th of October. The title of this year's conference is Sleepwalking into War, ? Opposing AUKUS, Nuclear Submarines and Nuclear Waste. Campaigning for a just, peaceful and sustainable world. And just for now, I'd like to mention just one other thing that's specific to the ACT, and that is a petition calling on the ACT Parliament to urgently act to end its complicity in Israeli crimes, human rights violations and genocide in Palestine. The petition is available on the ACT Parliament website, and it closes on the 26th of August. So now to today's forum. We have 3 fine speakers, each of whom will speak for 10 to 15 minutes before a question and answer session at the end. And we're aiming to finish by about 4:15. Our first speaker is Professor Richard Tanter, Director of the Nautilus Institute at the University of Melbourne. Professor Tanter is an expert on the joint Australia-US spy base, Pine Gap. And today he'll be speaking about the role of Pine Gap in the Gaza genocide. Sadly, Professor Tanter is unable to be with us in person today, so we have him on Zoom. So over to you, Professor Tanter.
Professor Jacka, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I am grateful to the organisers. Hang on, I am on audio. I'm very grateful to the organisers for making it possible for me to do this by Zoom. I'd much rather have been with you in person. I'm speaking from Naarm, well, from Marybeck in Wurundjeri country, and as Professor Jacka pointed out, that's a matter identifying ourselves as to the country. The actual country we live in is far more than a matter of elementary politeness now. It draws attention to what we want the country to be and how we want to think about it. And in particular, that opens up the possibility of understanding exactly what being colonisers, in part of my case, and colonised really means. And that's very clear that is an enormously important factor in the formation of Australia's foreign policy. It's not some compartmentalised matter. It affects pretty much everything about how we think about it. And of course, it's no accident that, for example, AUKUS, that somewhat ridiculous and very ominous development, ridiculous because of the UK part of it, is about the Anglosphere, which we still are locked in and identify. This is obviously highly relevant to the issue of the colonisation of Gaza, the war of occupation and frankly genocide that Israel is conducting there. I'm going to speak fairly briefly today about some materials which appear to be a bit technical, so I won't go into technical details. I'll be very happy to elaborate on that. There are some slides, some of which I won't use, but they're all going to be available to you through the organisers if you want to pursue it, including in the last 2 links to more detailed explanations, including other webinars where I've talked about these things a bit more slowly and in a bit more detail. And of course, I'd be very happy to answer questions, but I don't want to impinge on the time of the other two speakers here. So let me just start by saying that I'm talking about, firstly, I'm talking about Pine Gap, Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap. It's about 17 kilometres outside Alice Springs. If you look at it, and you can from the aeroplane when you fly into Alice Springs, if you're on the right side of the plane, which is actually the left side, but never mind, you can see these out in the desert, this beautiful, beautiful landscape of the McDonnell Ranges nestled between two folds far away. You'll see a set of what look like white golf balls. Those golf balls are in fact plastic radomes, radome covers, which are there partly to protect Pine Gap, the antennas, the giant parabolic antennas, like the antennas you used to have, or you have to watch your satellite TV. They are, the covers are there to protect the antennas from the environment, very dusty, windy, and in Alice Springs, but of course also to prevent, well, people like me and probably people with nastier intent from working out exactly what Pine Gap is listening to. Pine Gap's been there since it started operating half a century ago in 1970. It's grown enormously now. One way of counting the size of it is physically, it's about 2 kilometres in one direction, 2 kilometres in another. Inside the very high security compound, there are now about 45 different antennas of different kinds. If you want to think about what does Pine Gap do, it's a spy base essentially. In technical terms, it does 3 different things. Firstly, it has big antennas which are pointed up to a particular part in the sky over the equator. And at that point over the equator, about 36,000 kilometres up, which is a very particular orbit around the Earth, there will be some satellite. There are satellites about 6 or 7 tons. And these particular satellites, which are called signals intelligence satellites, have a whole forest of antennas listening to the very faint signals, different kinds of signals from the ground, cell phones, radios, radars, communications, microwave communications, great many things, but they're very faint. 36,000 kilometres is a long way away, and then coming back down is a long way further. So some of these antennas on these signals intelligence satellites are enormous. The bigger the antenna, the better chance you have of picking up these very faint signals. The main antenna on 4 of these satellites I'm going to talk about today is about 100 metres across. That's absolutely enormous. Australia, through Pine Gap, controls, in a technical sense, not in a political sense, but in a technical sense, controls what 4 of those signals intelligence satellites do, where to point them, which bits of which signals to try and pick up, and so forth. So that's Pine Gap's first role, space-based signals intelligence, a matter of big ears up in the sky. That makes sense? So this will be very clear when we talk about Gaza. The second is actually the same thing, but in reverse. There are another set of antennas on the ground at Pine Gap pointing up at other people's satellites, particularly other people's communication satellites. So, for example, they would point at Indonesia's telecommunication satellites. If you go to Bali, you try and talk to Australia, that signal is relayed through telecommunication satellites. They also, of course, listen to the Allies. But for example, in the Middle East, they listen to all of the very dense network of commercial Middle Eastern satellites, which of course are extremely important to, well, pretty much everyone in the Middle East, but especially in these days of appalling destruction in Gaza, to those people who can get access to cell phones. The third thing that Pine Gap does, I'm not going to really talk about today, but just so you know, there is a separate part of Pine Gap. Those first 2 parts are concerned with signals intelligence, spying with ears, if you like, concerned with detecting the infrared signals from space on another set of satellites the infrared signals from the Earth's surface of the launch of missiles, and particularly in these days of missile warfare, you can work out how important that is. But let's set that third one aside. Let me just show you a little bit, if I may just share, just to say a little bit about this. Here we go. Okay, I put it in the wrong place. Clever, Richard. Okay, so here are the satellite. Oh, here's Pine Gap, just so we don't go away. So here's Pine Gap. As I say, the big, giant, upside-down T. These giant radomes here, they're really very, very big here. But then a whole lot of smaller ones here. Over here are the infrared satellite links I talked about. Down here is that upside down one I mentioned of the ground station listening to, say, Middle Eastern countries' communication satellites. All of this is really enormously important to America. There is only one other place on Earth outside the United States which is at all like this, and that's a companion station run officially by the United Kingdom, but in fact entirely run by the United States National Security Agency in Yorkshire in England. And I'll leave that to one side now. The reason that I'm involved in all of this work is because of the International Court of Justice rulings in the case brought by South Africa against Israel, on which the International Court of Justice, including the full bench, including an Australian judge, Hilary Charlesworth, ruled on 26th of January of this year that there is a plausible case for South Africa for South Africa's claims that Israel is committing acts of genocide. Now, this is a legal approach to it. You and I might think that that's pretty much unarguable. What's remarkable is the ICJ has never before done anything like this and ordered Israel as an interim measure to take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of acts within the scope of the Genocide Convention, which I'll just remind you means killing members of the group, which is people in Palestine, causing bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. I don't think anyone can be looking even at what comes in what passes for our news media in Australia to know that there is a very high level of truth about all of these matters. Israel was instructed to take measures to stop these things. Australia, as a state party, a signatory to that Genocide Convention, is also obliged to assist the court to ensure that this result, this interim requirement, the real long-term judgment will be a long term away, but this interim judgment based on plausible risk of irreparable prejudice to the rights of Palestinians, we have a responsibility in law, which we are wholeheartedly ignoring. One way in which we ignore it is that we allow the United States, and we assist the United States, to conduct signals intelligence for all manner of cell phone, for all manner of interception and decrypting and capturing and analysing all manner of satellite phone communications, cell phone communications, military radios of all kinds. There probably aren't any microwave towers left in Gaza that are operating, but we do know that some people do have these kinds of electronic communications. And of course, the resistance in Gaza does operate radios short in terms of very short range ones through the tunnels, which Israel, of course, is targeting. We also know that they have other ways of communicating electronically, which they're not being very publicly about. Israel is a very, very good signals intelligence collecting nation, technically, and they devote enormous energy to this. It's one way they try and control the West Bank, but they also get a lot of assistance from the United States quite directly. I think we know there are 5 reasons for thinking in a pretty strict sense. This is in relation to a legal complaint I gave to the government about 4 or 5 months ago. But so it's pretty limited. I think if I were talking more generally, I'd be going a lot further. We know that technically American signals intelligence satellites of a particular type, those ones sitting 36,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface, we know that ones controlled through Pine Gap have coverage of the Gaza Strip. So technically, we know this is possible. This is undoubted. Secondly, we know historically that those types of satellites controlled by Pine Gap through Pine Gap have resulted in the United States providing military intelligence to Israel. In other words, there's a flow of intelligence from activities which are monitored over Gaza, picked up by American intelligence satellites, downloaded to Pine Gap. A lot of processing work happens there on them. That's forwarded to the United States government, the United States National Security Agency in Washington, and then it's passed to Israel. And it is militarily quite important. Historically, we know that. Thirdly, we do know, as I just said, that there is a constant and virtually automatic flow of intelligence data. Vast, I should say, this is not some, simple operation. These are huge, complex operations intercepting vast amounts of data all the time. And that flows from Pine Gap to the United States National Security Agency, which is not only the biggest intelligence agency in the United States, it's the most important one. And then the fourth part of the puzzle is we know, as a matter of fact, as a matter of documented fact, that there is a rich web of intelligence cooperation agreements between the National Security Agency and the Israel Defense Force. And we know that this has increased enormously in recent decades. And so, in other words, we know there is an automatic flow of data there. When I say data, the Israelis have a right to, of course, process intelligence analyses, which is what happens at Pine Gap and also in Washington, in the National Security Agency. But we also know they have a right to get what the Americans would call raw, unprocessed intelligence data, which can tell them a lot more on certain occasions. And I guess the really important point today, politically, about Pine Gap and Australia and Israel is that if the Australian government wished to show that their understanding that that International Court of Justice interim decision is something we care a lot about. We care about international law. We care about our adherence to the Genocide Convention. Then the Australian government could just say to the United States, okay, we are not doing anything to disturb the alliance, but we have a respect for law, and we would like you to understand that we are, at least until a final judgment from the ICJ comes down on this matter of genocide, to avoid our risk of Australian complicity in genocide, we will not pass on any intelligence to the NSA, which is militarily relevant to the events in Gaza. Or the United States could do the same thing to Israel. And of course, neither has happened. I think that really pretty much brings me to the end of the time, so I'm not going to say much more, except I will just say one more thing, which I've not talked with Catherine about. I mentioned briefly the third system at Pine Gap, those giant infrared telescopes on satellites, again, like the signals intelligence ones, 36,000 kilometers above the Earth, staring down at a particular part of the Earth's surface. What these are there for is to look for, in the Americans' objectives, the launch of missiles against the United States or its allies. And that gives, if you like, in one version of it, the American president the proverbial 15 minutes to decide whether they're going to press the button so that the other side goes to Armageddon, as America does. But it also provides the information to American and, in our part of the world, Japanese, and in the Middle East, Israeli missile defense systems. So that is part of the way in which Israel is protected by American military facilities in Australia. Now, you might take the view that that's good, that all countries should be protected from missile attack. But of course, it's not all countries. And that takes us to the heart of the possibility that Israel, which is probably, depending how you do your counting, the 5th or 6th largest nuclear power in the world with at least 90 nuclear warheads, a major proliferator, very obviously, what that means about our attachment to another form of genocide. I'll leave it there, Catherine. Thank you very much.